Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Spirit Alive. We welcome Tom back tonight. And just so you know, I can't see you, but just so you know, we have Matthew put up all of the previous recordings of Tom's classes tonight, and I think also Sister Carol Dempsey. So I know some of you have written and said, where can I see them? Everything so far is up, and we thank Matthew very much for his work. So Tom, welcome back, and thank you. We're looking forward to tonight.
Great, my pleasure. Just give me 1 second to pull up the PowerPoint. Okay, wonderful. Welcome, everybody. This is session 4 of American Catholic History, Telling the Story Anew. And for this session, I'd like us to revisit U.S. Catholicism in the middle decades of the 20th century. So I've been calling this mid-century modern, to think about those pivotal decades and in how, in some ways, they capture sort of a modern sentiment that's emerging in U.S. Catholicism. These decades coincide with the post-World War II period and the baby boom era. And this is often a period that includes the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which many of you know was announced in 1959 and took place between 1962 and 1965. Yet I'm choosing tonight not to focus on the reforms and the reception of the Council. I'm going to explore those a little bit next week. Skipping over Vatican II is very much intentional. I'd like to encourage us to think about the changes taking place in American Catholicism before the Council and those changes that were taking place independent of the Council. Too often, Vatican II becomes the causal explanation for everything. It becomes an artificial dividing line. Vatican II was most certainly a watershed moment in the history of Catholicism, not just in the US, but globally. But still, there are dangers with attributing all changes to the reforms of the Council or the fuzzier spirit of Vatican II. It can make the pre-Vatican II years seem static, like an era frozen in time, where Catholic life continued on just the way it always had since time immemorial. But as we will see, there were many changes taking place within US Catholicism during this era that made it much more dynamic than we might initially suspect. And I should start off with perhaps a word of warning or a caveat. I realize that there's some danger as I talk about this period because it might be a time period that some listeners sort of lived through, experience, and have personal memories of. And that's certainly kind of an important sort of thing for historians to keep in mind in these sorts of presentations. But on the other side of things, we're now seeing a generational change among the historical profession. Those who are now writing about this time period are no longer necessarily part of the Vatican II generation, the baby boom generation, the post-war generation. Previously, that was the generation doing Catholic scholarship. So it's going to be interesting to see how this era will come to be reassessed as those who study and write about it are no longer the ones who lived through this time period. And yet, even for somebody like a Gen X Catholic like me, there's an unmistakable romance to this era. For many, this is a golden age for American Catholicism. It was a time when church pews were full, when Catholic schools were bursting at the seams, and vocations plentiful. For those in tight-knit Catholic neighborhoods, Catholicism shaped the patterns of daily life. It enveloped individuals, families, and communities. The all-encompassing Catholic world could be comforting, but it could also be confining. Speaking of her childhood, novelist Mary Gordon confessed that, quote, "Until I went to college, I had no genuine contact with anyone who wasn't Catholic." Needless to say, Catholics could be very parochial in their outlook. As another person remarked, "We lived in a Catholic ghetto, but what a wonderful ghetto it was." One could fill an entire bookshelf with the many growing up Catholic memoirs produced by this generation. The experiences of parish, family, and school helped forge an indelible sense of Catholic identity among those who grew up in the world of mid-20th century Catholicism. So this is just sort of a sampling of titles. Some of them are sort of personal memoirs. Some are more humorous accounts, like that Raised Catholic and Growing Up Catholic, two books that I think appeared in the 1980s. But also sort of serious Catholic scholarly studies that really sort of go and assess this time period. Mary Ellen O'Donnell's Ingrained Habits sort of looks at the experience of Catholic childhood during this period. So there's sort of a small cottage industry of Catholic memoirs that has emerged. And part of what sort of stands out in these accounts are things like the clear sense of moral order, a sense of right and wrong. The responses of the Baltimore Catechism were permanently etched into the mind. Rules and order assumed a central place in daily life. In her memoirs, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor recalls her Catholic education in the Bronx. Quote, "Discipline was what made a Catholic school a good investment in my mother's eyes. Among the black bonneted nuns who managed classrooms of 40 or 50 kids in my school, discipline was virtually an eighth sacrament," she wrote. Priests and sisters were held up as models of holiness and granted unquestioned authority on account of their vocation. They held a privileged place within the Catholic community. And of course, today we now have to wrestle with the darker side of that system of clerical authority, with the sex abuse crisis. The high point of the abuse crisis would not emerge until the 1960s and 1970s, but we have to ask what it was about this earlier era that laid the conditions for that abuse to take place. One of the formative experiences for this generation was the Cold War. And this had sort of multiple effects on Catholic community life. On the one hand, it mobilized Catholics in a unified spiritual crusade. You have groups like the Blue Army of Fatima, established in 1947, that encouraged sort of praying for the conversion of Russia. It became part of the pattern of parish life during this time period. Catholics also worked to sort of announce the dangers and educate their own about the dangers of communism. This took place sort of in formal sort of newspaper accounts and things like that, but also in a lot of material that was geared towards Catholic youth. So the treasure chest of fact and fiction was a kind of a Catholic comic book that was produced by the Flom Company, a textbook publisher out in Dayton, Ohio. But they published these comic books that included sort of accounts of saintly heroes and prevented Catholic life and things like that. But it also had very many issues that dealt with the communist threat. And you can see that one issue with sort of the juxtaposition of the hammer and sickle with the torch of Lady Liberty. They also produced classroom aids for teachers. The image that you have there of Pope John the 23rd and that map of the spread of the Soviet Union was actually part of a set of classroom posters that I discovered when I was helping my aunt clean through some stuff in her attic. And we discovered this set of posters that was sent to her back when she was a Catholic school teacher. And so I sort of quickly grabbed them because they're a great teaching aid. But I also have to sort of, in that moment, I also wondered about the effectiveness, because here was my aunt who was sent these posters for her classroom and then, proceeded to sort of tuck them away in a drawer. And we pulled them out in pristine condition at the end. But these were mailed out to Catholic classrooms across the country, and they became part of the educational message. The Cold War also allowed Catholics to demonstrate their patriotism. US and Vatican interests overlapped on the issue. Catholics no longer had to choose where to put their political loyalties. They were one and the same. The Cold War made Catholics very comfortable with American values, and this included formal church messaging. Earlier, official Catholic thought was often critical of notions of liberty, of individualism, and of free market ideology. But during the Cold War, the Catholic Church moved to embrace principles of democratic governance, the capitalist system with certain limits, and individual autonomy in a way that it hadn't before. So suddenly, kind of American values and Catholic values overlapped. There was a synergy there. Catholics no longer had to choose their loyalties. And even despite their sort of lingering anti-Catholicism, like those that swirled around the election of JFK, kind of Catholics were seen as political insiders by this time. And so the fact that Catholics were so strongly anti-communist made them kind of quintessentially American. During this time period, we also have Catholics enjoying their moment in the sun when it came to sort of American popular culture. We had films like Going My Way and Bells of St. Mary's, 1944 and 1945, that filled theaters and earned accolades. On the Waterfront was another major hit, showcasing the work of Catholic labor priests on the New York docks. And then somebody like Fulton Sheen became a national celebrity, rivaling Milton Berle for TV viewership with his Life is Worth Living, which aired between 1952 and 1955. He managed to bring sort of Thomistic philosophy and Catholic thought to the masses, attracting not just Catholic viewership, but kind of other Americans who were hungry for spiritual messaging during the Cold War. And still to this day, he continues to have a sizable viewership because many of his episodes are available on YouTube. And so there's been sort of a resurgence of popularity for Fulton Sheen. And with all of this sort of Catholics and popular culture, the look of Catholics was changing. Catholics were no longer foreign or ethnic, but they became kind of all-American. They moved from the laboring classes to the comfortable middle class. And I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about that dynamic in all of this. For many Catholics, the post-war period was an era of dramatic socioeconomic advancement. Catholics were among the beneficiaries of post-war prosperity, and you could argue that they were probably the prime beneficiaries of post-war prosperity. The immigrant generation moved up the economic ladder at a remarkable rate. And I can think of my own family history in part of this. My grandparents on my mother's side, my grandfather was a tailor. My grandmother had maybe a 6th grade education. She was born in 1909, and so she was sort of went to work very early. Schooling was not sort of part of the expectation for her. And yet my mother, went to high school, went to college, became a teacher, earned a master's degree in English. So those sorts of that jump from the working class to kind of the educated class was something that happened in one generation. Working class Catholics, even those who didn't go off to college, working class Catholics also benefited from a robust labor market and generous pay and benefits secured by union contracts. Blue-collar jobs offered pathways to economic security and middle-class comfort. Catholics also benefited greatly from the GI Bill and its mortgage benefits, which allowed many young families to purchase a home, spurring a real estate boom and encouraging suburban development. And we have kind of these images here sort of showing the way that Catholic life was moving towards this sort of middle-class ideal. We have this 1951 model home. This was advertised by the Catholic War veterans, sort of promoting kind of a new housing development near the Belt Parkway in South Brooklyn. Also have kind of the blessing of the cars, which was in some ways kind of a parish routine. The way that you could sort of bless other elements of Catholic life, blessing a home or things like that. Now you're sort of celebrating this sort of middle-class attainment that was captured in sort of car ownership. The GI Bill, in addition to offering sort of mortgage benefits and things like that, also provided educational opportunities for returning veterans. Those who never would have thought that higher education was possible now flooded into colleges and universities. Part of the goal for the GI Bill was to help sort of diffuse the rush of returning veterans into the labor market and to help to spread it out. There was concern that after the war, the labor market would not be able to absorb all of the returning veterans. And so one way to prevent them from flooding factories and jobs was to give them alternative opportunities. And so sending them off to college to develop a new skill base was part of the solution. And as part of that GI Bill, it wasn't just the veterans themselves who benefited, but Catholic colleges and universities themselves did as well. They were eligible for these GI tuition benefits, which enabled a new stream of students to enter Catholic colleges, universities, and provided impetus and revenue for that expansion. The vast majority of those entering Catholic colleges during the post-war years were the first in their families to go to college. One student at LaSalle College in Philadelphia remembered overhearing at a mixer, quote, "Oh, LaSalle boys, they're all the sons of bartenders and streetcar conductors." Admittedly, LaSalle, which was operated by the Christian Brothers, had always had working class roots. But that comment could easily have applied to other schools, whether Seton Hall or Fordham. Among this new generation of Catholic collegiates, some went for a traditional four-year degree, but others took night classes in fields like business and accounting, which allowed them to gain professional credentials. Some of the images that you have on the screen are from Villanova, which sort of showcases how that school was transformed in the immediate post-war years. They not only recruited veterans and offered guidance service for veterans, they had to deal with a housing crunch. They provided sort of temporary housing in the field house, setting up bunks that you see in the upper image. And then they also had some sort of barrack-like housing that became known as the Vets Village. So other Catholic colleges wound up using sort of like old repurposed Quonset huts in order to have temporary facilities for classes and housing. As a result of this sort of educational attainment, and here I would also include high school. This is the first generation, this sort of post-war Catholic generation. This is the first generation for whom high school education becomes the norm. As a result of those educational gains, the post-war and baby boom generation became one of the most highly educated generations of Catholics in US history. There was an intellectual hunger and energy that would reshape Catholic life. Educational attainment created a vast middle-brow Catholic culture, eager to educate themselves about their faith. The circulation of Catholic newspapers, magazines, journals, books, and other media increased dramatically. There was an entire economy of Catholic publishers who worked to respond to this demand and cultivate Catholic thought. Catholic bookstores popped up in major cities throughout the United States, and we can look at examples of something like Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, published in 1948, which became a bestseller, not just among Catholics, but non-Catholics as well, helping to shape the views of those who were looking for spiritual guidance in an age of Cold War anxiety. Merton's genius was to repackage Catholic spiritual wisdom for an atomic age, offering guidance on how Catholics could attain a rich interior life. Education invited lay Catholics to think with the church in a way that they hadn't before. And you want to remember that those who attended Catholic colleges during this time period didn't just have their own majors, but pretty much every Catholic college graduate walked out of those schools with a minor or second major in theology and philosophy as a result of the core curriculum that all of them would have followed. This meant that clergy were not the only ones who studied church teachings. Educated lay Catholics broadened that community of conversation. These were no longer the immigrant generation Catholics schooled simply to pay, pray, and obey. Reflecting on this trend, sociologist Andrew Greeley published a short piece in 1964 that talked about the new breed. It was his term for this new generation of lay members, well-educated and professional, that had risen up as the baby boom generation came of age. He confessed that the new breed can be a bit of a puzzle and may not agree among themselves on all things. But he found them to be an exceptionally dedicated bunch, but with a new set of values. He wrote, quote, "They are greatly concerned about things like honesty, integrity, and authenticity. They must know the reason why. They do not refuse to obey, but before they obey, they want to sit down and discuss the reasons for orders." They weren't ideologues or radicals, Greeley insists, but they were driven by a desire for personal fulfillment. Quote, "It's from the ranks of this new breed that volunteers are recruited for organizations like the Peace Corps or PAVLA, the Papal Volunteers for Latin America, and especially the various inner-city student groups that are spreading across the country like a prairie fire." In describing the sort of the methods of this new breed, he said how they, quote, "They know how to work with committees, to write brochures, to give speeches, raise money, utilize community resources, and issue press releases. They brought to the church new energy and new talents, but their desire to know why sometimes made them not so easy to deal with. New breed parishioners began to expect a higher degree of competence from their pastors, who were no longer necessarily the most educated members of the parish. The new breed was, quote, "the product of a revolution of expanding expectations." They were restless, but also loyal and committed to the church. Greeley writes, quote, "They have been told that they are the church so often that they now believe it. And while they may dislike many of the things that they see in the church today, they are sophisticated enough to know that these things can be changed, and young enough to think that they are going to help change them." To Greeley, this was part of the attitude that they brought to the Vatican II Church, with its call for greater lay participation in the life of Catholicism. But the groundwork for this new breed was laid well before the council. It was part of the baby boom generation and their experiences growing up. Admittedly, these were just Greeley's on-the-fly sociological musings based on his own observations. They were offered without any sort of quantifiable evidence or survey data. But I think they capture something of this generation. Members of this new breed were staunchly Catholic. They could not consider themselves apart from the institution that had shaped and nurtured them. And if there was something, they wanted to make sure that they brought their gifts and talents in service to the church. But if there was something in the church that they did not like, they wanted to see it change, and they wanted to be the agents of change from within. I think that's very different from sort of a generation of Catholics that comes later on, where if there's something they don't agree with the church on, it's easier to walk away. This generation simply could not walk away from their own Catholicism. And so they wanted to sort of see the church remade, and they saw themselves as being agents of that. As we think about Catholic education in the post-war years, we can also think about the educational experience at the grade school and the high school level. And as wonderful as those schools were, it was also a system that was under strain. In the post-war years, religious communities struggled to meet the staffing needs of the baby boom generation. Even at a time when vocations were plentiful and religious orders were growing, their numbers simply did not meet the needs to staff all of the schools and all of the ministries that sisters had committed themselves to, or that were called upon to commit themselves to. And as a result, sisters themselves started to push for reform. In 1949, Sister Madaleva Wolf, the president of St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, gave an address to the National Catholic Educational Association. In her talk, she called attention to the plight of many young sisters who found themselves placed in front of classrooms of 40 or 50 children, or even more, without proper preparation. She began her talk describing the formation of a Sister Lucy, how she was sent for her undergraduate degree before being assigned to ministry, and how she had the proper qualifications for the subjects she was about to teach. But then Sister Madaleva revealed what everybody in the room already knew. There were very few Sister Lucys. Preparation was a luxury that few young sisters at that time enjoyed. Sister Madaleva had let out the secret. She said the quiet part out loud. Speaking of young sisters, she said, quote, "Nothing can possibly do more to undermine her vocation than to send her out to try and teach without adequate, often without any preparation. Nothing can so disillusion her in her community as the dishonesty of assigning her to do in the name of holy obedience what professionally she is unqualified to do," end quote. In other words, professing vows and donning a habit did not suddenly make one a teacher. But it wasn't just about academic training. Madaleva insisted that sisters needed time for their own religious formation before they were sent out into ministry. Religious communities too often denied their young members the time to develop spiritually as sisters before throwing them into the lion's den of third graders, or worse yet, high school sophomores. It was bad for students and it was bad for sisters. And Madaleva recognized the immense pressure that religious communities faced. Quote, "Never before have parishes been in a position to build schools before they could staff them. Naturally, there is a clamor for sisters to teach in them." She's writing in 1949. People were recognizing the demographic bubble. In 1952, only 16% of sister teachers had completed at least 3 years of college before assuming their teaching assignments. Many sisters of this generation did eventually earn their undergraduate degrees, but often by taking courses over the summer, which meant that it often took them 10, 15, or even 20 years to complete their baccalaureate degrees. To Madaleva, religious communities needed to invest in the formation of their members. Failing to do so was an injustice to them and to the order. Sister Madaleva herself, though now a university president at the time she gave this talk, had been placed in full-time teaching before she had finished her own baccalaureate degree, and she never forgot the anxiety and discouragement of that inadequate training. Sister Madaleva would continue to be a voice encouraging religious superiors to see to their members' ongoing intellectual formation. And her address in 1949 served as a catalyst for the creation of the Sisters Formation Conference in 1954, a grassroots movement among religious communities to share information and to advocate for sisters' needs. And so part of this was to sort of better develop sisters. The lower image is a group of school sisters of Notre Dame in Wisconsin who started having their own sort of teacher conferences and formation sessions. And this was not the only challenge to Catholic education at this time period. Some, including members of the laity, began to question the need for parochial schools, which were seen as the cornerstone of parish life. In 1964, laywoman Mary Perkins Ryan published a piece entitled, quote, "Are Parochial Schools the Answer?" And she wrote, "A general education under Catholic auspices is no longer as necessary or even as desirable as in the past. As things are, the maintenance of our Catholic school system, not to speak of its extension, takes up a large part of our available human resources now needed for urgent religious tasks." So for her, the question was this rush to invest everything in schools at a time when perhaps she worried that they were sort of now a barrier for Catholics, preventing them from engaging with non-Catholics and entering into kind of the American mainstream. And those same Catholic schools had become an increasing burden to maintain. The cost of maintaining the system became a concern by the late 1960s, when inflationary pressures drove up costs across the board. Between 1967 and 1971, the operating costs of parish schools in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia increased from 15.5 million to 28.8 million. And many parishes began to run significant deficits. By the 1970s, the Philadelphia Archdiocese began charging tuition at its high schools for the first time. And that was coming after sort of seeing tuition-free Catholic education as being a point of pride. Part of what happens during this post-war generation is a shift to suburbia. And I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what that meant for the Catholic community at mid-century. When I talk to my students about Catholics in the post-war generation, I often start with a little story about a Catholic parish founded in Levittown. And here this is Levittown, Pennsylvania, not Levittown, Long Island. But one of the new parishes was founded in the 1950s. Shortly after the church was dedicated, the pastor found himself desperate to negotiate the purchase of some additional land for the parish. And this was curious because the parish already had a church, a school, a convent, and a rectory. All the essential elements of the parish plant were in place. So what else could this pastor in Levittown, Pennsylvania, have needed the land for? Well, in making plans for the new parish, diocesan planners had failed to account for one critical new need: parking. It may seem trivial, but it shows how the rhythms of parish life had begun to change as Catholics moved from urban neighborhoods to suburban districts. And the suburban growth was remarkable. At the end of the Second World War, there were just shy of 300 parishes on Long Island, and this includes Brooklyn, Queens, Suffolk, and Nassau County. Of those 300, 214 were in the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens. In 1960, there were still many that were still in the city, but during that time, the number of parishes on Long Island had grown from 81 to 114 in only 15 years. Catholic life would be different in the suburbs. And here are there kind of a number of things that we can think about. During the time period after the war, sort of many Catholic commentators, priests, started talking about the piety void. They mentioned that sort of Catholics were no longer showing up for First Fridays or Eucharistic adoration or Catholic devotions that had once been the lifeblood of the immigrant parish. The Holy Name Society no longer attracted the same numbers that it used to. But at the same time, that piety void was also a reflection of how Catholic life shifted. You know, it was one thing to be able to stop by a Catholic parish when it was a neighborhood institution and sort of people could simply walk to church. Now, with car culture, people in suburbs were more dependent on car transportation to make it to those parishes. So it meant that kind of attending those sort of parish devotions took a little bit more effort than it might have, and especially for kind of working sort of the suburban wives who may not have access to an automobile. Sometimes going to the parish became a little bit more difficult. But amid that piety void, some of what was also happening was that the rhythms of Catholic spirituality were shifting from the parish to the growth to the sort of the nuclear family. During the post-war years, we see the growth of a more family-centered spirituality among Catholics. We have individuals like Father Peyton, who established the Family Rosary Crusade. It was that crusade that popularized the phrase, "The family that prays together stays together." Groups like the Christian Family Movement encouraged families to practice religious rituals within the home. By defining the family as the primary unit of worship, undercut some of the devotionalism of previous generations, which were often organized by sodalities or single-sex groups. Rituals like the enthronement of the Sacred Heart in the home became sort of a reflection of this new family-based spirituality. The guidebook for the enthronement of the Sacred Heart included a set of frequently asked questions, and one stated whether a priest must perform the enthronement, and the answer was no. The consecration of the family to the Sacred Heart can be made by any member of the family, with or without the presence of a priest, in the home or collectively in the church. And so this was a shift from that immigrant generation where the goal was to bring Catholic devotions into the life of the parish and connect them to sacramental culture. And now it's sort of flowing back out into the communities. The nuclear family was very much the sort of the core of this new family-centered spirituality. And there's an image at the bottom. It's taken from a stained glass window at a parish in suburban Philadelphia, where kind of at the bottom of the larger stained glass windows in the parish, it had sort of images of the sacraments. And in this particular one, it sort of shows the sacrament of matrimony on the one side, and then it shows kind of the nuclear family in kind of this quintessential leave it to beaver, father knows best image, with the father sitting in his armchair, feet up. The mother is serving drinks. The one daughter is doing homework at a table. The son is watching television, which is sort of the family hearth there in the scene. And it was very curious that if you see the whole window, this happened to be under a larger stained glass window, which showed Adam and Eve in the garden. So it was this sort of connection from the story of creation, sort of divinely ordained family life that flowed from the story of Adam and Eve directly to the 1950s, 1960s nuclear family. It's just sort of this great image of how Catholics were thinking at that time. Part of what was also happening in the shift to suburbia was the eroding of earlier boundaries. Catholics who had previously been consigned to ethnic parishes now mixed together in suburban churches. Those who were previously Irish, Polish, Italian, or German were now simply American. After World War II, dioceses, for the most part, stopped establishing ethnic parishes, and so all of the suburban growth was no longer going to be divided along those ethnic lines. And I think it's also, we can think about how it became easier for Catholics in the post-war period to think of themselves as American. This was a time period when immigration had been largely cut off in the United States. Immigration restrictions were put in place in the 1920s and weren't lifted until 1964. So you have an entire generation of Catholics who are perhaps the only generation of Catholics in American Catholic history who haven't seen the church transformed by waves of immigration, of new immigration. So that also sort of helps present this new American image of the church, because you no longer have kind of newcomers constantly sort of filling the church pews. So that helps American Catholics think of themselves as much more American. Suburbia also lowers some of the boundaries, not just among Catholics themselves, but also between Catholics and their non-Catholic neighbors. Scholars have talked about this as a period of backyard ecumenism, where Catholics who had been raised on kind of suspicions of interactions with Protestants now discover that they might be living next door to Methodists or Presbyterians or Jews. And so suddenly those distinctions sort of disappear. And they discover that sort of non-Catholics are okay. And it makes Catholics rethink some of their kind of prescriptions about interacting with non-Catholics. The idea that before Vatican II, that Catholics weren't even supposed to sort of set foot in a Protestant church. That becomes more difficult to uphold when your neighbors might invite you to a christening, or if you have to attend the funeral of a non-Catholic neighbor. Politeness dictates that you go to those events. And even church leaders began to rethink some of those sort of absolute bans and prescriptions on interacting with non-Catholics. There was one Catholic bishop who, sort of commenting about sort of Cold War efforts to fight communism, he sort of talked about how silly it was that Catholics weren't supposed to be involved in ecumenical prayer services. How can Catholics sort of fight godless communism if they can't even pray together with non-Catholics, was his message. I also like to sort of think about how the look of Catholic churches was changing during this time period. We often attribute the changes in Catholic architecture to Vatican II, but even during this time, kind of Catholic churches started to take on a new, distinctly modern look. The one church there, St. Thomas Aquinas in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, was dedicated in 1956. And when it was opened, it talked about how it incorporated many of the, quote, latest features of contemporary architecture, including wood laminate arches and acoustic ceiling tiles. So we're no longer building those sort of Gothic cathedrals of old. The other church, Immaculate Conception at Levittown, was kind of an auditorium-style church where they emphasized building the school, and the church sort of was the kind of the gym auditorium space that was sort of used at the time. And this one I love as well. It's sort of relevant for tonight's talk. This was a brochure for drive-in masses at St. Anne's Church in Brentwood, Long Island. I do not know the parish. Perhaps one of the members of the audience knows of this place or even has an experience of a drive-in mass. But apparently this continued from 1955 to 1968. You can see the schedule of masses for the drive-in from June until September with 4 Sunday masses, and then a different schedule for October through May. And they had a capacity of 260 cars. So now suddenly, what does it mean to be a worshiping community when you are quite literally sort of sitting in your family automobile as a nuclear family unit? This certainly does change the rhythms of Catholic life. One of the other things that the shift to suburbia does, in a way that we're just now starting to understand, is that it changed Catholics' relationship to the city. Older parishes struggled with the outflow of members, especially younger families. Urban parishes became older and grayer. And it's striking how communities that had once been seen as vibrant Catholic neighborhoods, communities in Brooklyn or Queens, maybe more Brooklyn than Queens, but places that had been sort of vibrant Catholic neighborhoods now came to be regarded as struggling inner city districts. That happens over the course of a generation. Looking at by the 1970s, we can see tensions between urban and suburban Catholics growing even more pronounced. Many Catholics who had physically and mentally distanced themselves from the city began to question the church's outreach and efforts and priorities. Some, for example, criticized the cost of maintaining schools that predominantly served non-Catholics. Writing to the Philadelphia Archdiocesan newspaper in 1976, one woman asked why parishes on the edge of the inner city that, quote, have the same hardships as our other parishes were being taxed to carry the burdens of the lower parts of the city. In the midst of the financial crisis in Catholic education of the 1970s, she and others began to question why so many resources were going to support city schools with large numbers of non-Catholic students. Another reader wrote, quote, teaching non-Catholics is the job of the public schools, and in these days of high inflation, we are turning away Catholic children from Catholic schools. And yet we have nuns teaching non-Catholic children in Catholic schools. Pastors and principals responded with a full-throated defense of their schools and reminded their critics of the importance of Catholic education to evangelization and uplift. A 1978 editorial on the church in the suburbs likewise urged suburban Catholics to remember their roots and their responsibilities, including generous support of missionary efforts in urban areas. So the point here is that you start to see this disconnect. Catholics who may have sort of grown up in kind of these inner city communities had now distanced themselves, and they questioned the church's commitment to those same communities that had nurtured them, those same parishes and schools. And one of the other things that happens with the move to the suburbs is that Catholics become more accepting of Catholic middle-class values and also Catholic racial values, including the benefits of whiteness. And here, I'd like to sort of end this evening, think about kind of the Catholic encounter with race, and if I have time to maybe talk a little bit about the Vietnam War experience as well. But I think sort of these issues of the Catholic encounter with race bring together some of these themes. Kind of what happens to sort of the Catholic innocence of the post-war era? What happens to sort of a Catholic commitment to the city? What happens to kind of Catholics' views as they enter the American mainstream? And that includes accepting American sort of racial values as well. And here, this is kind of a complicated story for Catholics, that sort of the Catholic encounter with race will include both positives and negatives, sort of high points, things that ought to be celebrated, but also sort of more challenging aspects of that history now that we look back. On the positive side, we see Catholics taking a strong stance in favor of civil rights, on fundamental human dignity. We have Catholics who are marching as part of these civil rights protests. We have sisters who joined in the march at Selma, even though the local archbishop in the diocese wanted to sort of keep these sort of Catholic outsiders from coming into the diocese and joining these marches. Even those sisters who were not able to go to places like Selma. The larger image on the right is Sisters of Charity, who joined in a march through Harlem. And their presence there made sort of front page news in the New York Times. This was a form of corporate witness. And the head of the Sisters of Charity received sort of letters of complaint asking why the Catholic sisters were there, why members of the Sisters of Charity were there. And the head of the order at the time, Sister Loretto Bernard, sort of responded saying that these sisters were there of their own volition. They gave up their sort of Sundays, their one free day, to be present. We also have Catholics who protested their own. So one of the smaller images, it's really hard to see, but it's Catholics in Chicago who were, including Catholic sisters, lay people, priests, who protested in front of the Catholic Women's Club of Chicago, an organization that at that time had barred Black Catholics from joining. So they were protesting kind of the own segregated structures. And then there's another image of the Catholic Interracial Council, one of these groups that was very active. Its membership was never very large, but it showed how Catholics were taking a stand on civil rights. But at the same time as these sort of civil rights protests, sort of demonstration marches were going on, kind of Catholic views of race and integration were decidedly mixed. One 1945 survey of Catholic high school students in Philadelphia found that 92% agreed that, quote, baptized Negroes are members of the mystical body of Christ. So they agreed on the theological principles. And 67% agreed that Blacks had the right to attend, that Black Catholics had the right to attend any Catholic church. But 94% of those respondents also favored restrictions of Black residents to certain areas of the city. This incongruity, this was sort of noted, was very jarring that there was this distinction between Catholic racial tolerance on the one hand and Catholic opposition to integrated neighborhoods on the other. And this Catholic, one other high point, I forgot I had this slide, but this was kind of, a book came out a couple years ago about crossing parish boundaries, which was a study of the CYO in Chicago. And so this was sort of one organization that helped promote integration through athletics. And I thought that the photograph chosen for the cover was really telling because it highlighted the CYO swim team. And if you're familiar with some of the fears over integration, things like pools were kind of one of the flashpoints of debates that sort of Catholic, sort of blacks and whites shouldn't be allowed to swim together. And so the fact that the CYO was doing that among its own members was in some ways a very sort of radical, provocative act. But at the same time as that was going on, we have Catholics who also joined in these protests barring integration. This is an image from Levittown, Pennsylvania, with the community sort of mobilizing to protest the first Black family that was moving into Levittown. And even though it's not sort of a specifically Catholic scene, one can only imagine that a large number of those who were present that evening were Catholics themselves. And so the Catholic sort of opposition to integration wasn't limited to the South. In fact, it was present throughout the urban North, places like Chicago, Milwaukee by the 1960s. Some of the strongest opposition to integration came from Catholic urban neighborhoods. In part, that was simply a reflection of demographic reality. Catholics were an outside presence in the nation's urban centers, and they were often kind of on the front lines of those neighborhoods that were integrating and that were transitioning. And there was a certain religious rationale for that opposition to neighborhood integration. Catholic parishes were fixed, their boundaries were set. And so if the Catholics in that parish move out to the suburbs, and Blacks move in, predominantly non-Catholic, the lifeblood of the parish was slowly being drained away. And so there was an effort to sort of not necessarily keep Blacks out, but also to keep Catholics in the neighborhood. So they're defending their territory, their turf, their very parish structures. Catholics spoke out on the integration problem. Here, to maybe highlight one story in all of this. Recently, American Catholic Studies featured an article on Sister Angelica Schultz, a Franciscan sister originally from Iowa, whose community sent her to teach at one of the schools they staffed in Chicago. She did not consider herself an activist, but in 1966, she joined an interracial group walking in support of opening housing through Gage Park, a predominantly Catholic neighborhood in Southwest Chicago, near Midway Airport. During that march, angry crowds yelled and jeered, and some began to throw stones, bottles, and other projectiles. And Sister Angelica made local and national headlines the next day as, quote, the nun hit by a brick, which had struck her in the back of the head. She recalled hearing the thrower shout, quote, "This is for you, nun." The Catholic press denounced the attack. An editorial in Chicago's Archdiocesan newspaper did not mince words. Quote, "For the first time in the history of the city, a nun was attacked on the streets of Chicago in a public demonstration. And the attack came from a mob of howling Catholics." But others kind of Catholics pushed back and said that Sister Angelica had disgraced her habit by being part of the demonstration. They wanted her to keep religion and politics separate, emphasizing kind of that the place of the sister was in the classroom, not in the streets. But in a letter to her religious order, Sister Angelica explained how she felt it was necessary to lance the infection of racism and to bring to the open the unchristian mentality of those attending our churches and schools. They seemed not to have heard the church's message on equality. And recently, this story of Sister Angelica was sort of illustrated, became sort of an online sort of web comic that's sort of there. The web address is there, but it's called sort of Bad Catholics, Good Trouble, sort of as a way of sort of teaching this story. And this became sort of just one example of many for how kind of Catholics were opposed to some of this integration, but also how it kind of became a moral crusade for many Catholics, including sisters who had experience working in inner city schools through their ministries. And that was Sister Angelica's case. And so it was that sort of encounter with kind of urban conditions and the plight of Black families that made them in the Second Vatican Council reassess their own ministries and recommit to urban ministry once they were given that option. So again, kind of, we often think of Vatican II as the moment when sort of Catholic sisters reassessed their ministry, but it was because they had such a presence in these urban communities that they knew that that's where they wanted to commit themselves. And some kind of resisted the call to go out to suburban schools because they felt it was the city schools where they were most needed. I'm running low on time here. I did have one additional slide that I wanted to end with, the story of the Catonsville Nine, which is sort of after the Vatican II marker that I had set for myself. But I think this is also an interesting story that makes us think about how the idea of what it meant to be a good Catholic changed over the course of this period. 2 years after Sister Angelica's story made headlines, Catholics in Baltimore were making headlines of their own. May 17th, 1968, 7 men and 2 women arrived at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Catonsville, Maryland. The hall housed a local selective service board. Members of the Catonsville group went in, grabbed draft piles, and took them out to the parking lot and set them on fire using homemade napalm. The act of civil disobedience was an act of protest against the Vietnam War and the shedding of innocent blood. The action attracted media attention, in part because the group had alerted reporters. It was led by Daniel and Philip Berrigan. Both were priests, Daniel a Jesuit and Philip a Josephite. In his prepared statement to the press, Berrigan apologized. He apologized, quote, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children. We could not, so help us God, do otherwise. This was part of the dramatic events of 1968, which included the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Senator Robert Kennedy, as well as student protests at Columbia and UC Berkeley. But looking back at this particular event, scholar Mark Massa had noted that the Catonsville Nine reflected a shift in definition of what it meant to be a good Catholic. Since the late 19th century, there was a presupposition that being a good Catholic was to be a faithful and law-abiding American citizen. Loyalty to the church and loyalty to the state were viewed as not just compatible, but mutually reinforcing. And during the Cold War, it also meant supporting US foreign policy and military action. But the action of the Catonsville Nine called that compatibility into question. Now, to be a good Catholic was to challenge authority. A good Catholic could not simply dismiss the sufferings of Vietnamese peasants half a world away, Massa writes. Nor could they assume that obeying government authority was always the correct thing to do. And this Catonsville Nine sort of leads to sort of other protests, the Milwaukee 14, the Harrisburg 7, the Camden 28, and others. And so part of this was sort of an awakening of kind of Catholics' moral conscience during that period. And so when Vatican II erupts and sort of, or not erupts, but when Vatican II starts emphasizing ideas like individual conscience, it's also being formed by kind of Catholics' own reflection on issues of race or the Vietnam War. It's 8 o'clock and I'm running a little bit longer than I had planned. But to conclude with a few final lessons here, I think that we need to recognize that this was a period of remarkable Catholic achievement, but we want to be mindful not to overly romanticize the post-war period. We want to be aware that many of the changes taking place were underway before Vatican II. These changes in Catholic life were demographic, educational, but also spiritual. And then when we do get to Vatican II, we want to be mindful that the reforms of the Second Vatican Council and other changes in Catholic life that happened later on were shaped by how we view this period in American history, or maybe reversing that, how we view the Catholic post-war period of the 1950s and 1960s shapes our understanding of the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. we can't separate those. So if we have a rosy vision of this period, it's going to shape the changes and perhaps make us sort of see the changes of Vatican II as sort of more jarring than they might be if we see this more as a continuum. We can think about how the movement from the margins to the mainstream reshaped Catholic identity and Catholic understanding. It helps us appreciate how American Catholics had started to absorb and accept American values. They were now the insiders rather than outsiders. And then sort of finally, when we look at sort of the Catholic encounter with race or Vietnam, we see these as a test of Catholic values and a Catholic coming of age in a morally complex world. For those who might have experienced perhaps a childhood innocence of the immediate post-war years, the issues of race in the civil rights era of the 1960s and the Vietnam War seem all the more jarring because there was something sort of insular and protective about that experience of growing up Catholic in the immediate post-war years that add to sort of the shock of that thing as that baby boom generation enters their teenage years, enters sort of adulthood. They now have to wrestle with morally complex issues in a way that doesn't always match the clear black and white moral vision that they were raised in during those post-war decades. So with that, I'm happy to sort of open this up to sort of some conversation over what I find are sort of really fascinating history, fascinating moment in American Catholic history, and one that sort of continues to shape our understanding of the Catholic present.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. I mean, I guess, everybody thinks that Vatican II is this watershed moment and that nothing really happened before that since the Council of Trent or the First Vatican Council. So it was really great to hear this. And I just want to add that St. Anne's Drive-In Parish is right adjacent to our mother house. So I wasn't there when they were still driving in. There may be sisters on the screen tonight who remember it as a drive-in parish, but it's kind of funny to learn that history. I think people can come in. I think Matthew's going to allow you to bring people in, and then they'll be able to raise their hands and talk to you if they want to. There is one question from Jean Price. Wouldn't the Sisters of Charity be in the Harlem area? Isn't the Seton Shrine up in Harlem? Well,
yeah, well, actually, we have Gene on the line, so we can sort of welcome him to sort of unmute and speak. I can see you. But yeah, sort of the Catholic Sisters of Charity had sort of several schools up in Harlem. The Seton Shrine itself isn't located in that neighborhood. Oh, we're getting a little bit of feedback. Gene, can you try?
Yeah, I don't know if that was me. I was going to mute myself. Yeah, I was thinking that isn't there there's a shrine up there north of Harlem though, isn't there?
not aware.
Or is
the Mother
is that, am
Cabrini
I thinking of
Shrine.
something? Cabrini, right. Okay.
So her shrine is up
So
in Washington Heights.
and Seton's is in Maryland. That's right. I'm sorry.
Right. And actually, sort of in 1960, when that was happening, there wouldn't have been a Seton Shrine yet because kind of her cause was moving forward. So
We're
they
still
didn't quite
moving
have
forward,
that
right.
that infrastructure. But it was kind of a remarkable scene to see all of these Catholic sisters. And when they're there marching, even though kind of the superior said they were there as individuals, that they chose to go on their own, the fact that they were in habits was a form of corporate witness. No sister represented simply herself. Once she was wearing that habit, she represented, kind of her entire community and the Catholic Church as a whole. Yeah, so thank you.
Right.
I'm not sure who's next. I see Elizabeth Hill as kind of the next square on my screen.
But no question, I don't think.
Oh, okay.
Anyone have a question? Just feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and then ask a question.
Sure. I see Steve Henry.
Yes, Thomas, I have a few comments regarding the whole aspect of racism within the church.
Mhm.
There was only one bishop that did any marching. Theodore Herzberg, who was the president of Notre Dame, was quite prominent. Bishop Hallahan, I believe in Louisiana, I believe he excommunicated a Catholic person who opposed busing. And that was the only thing. But for the most part, there was religious sisters and also priests involved. Very few bishops were involved in the civil rights movement. When I was in graduate school, I had three American theologians that participated, and they mentioned that to me.
There's an interesting little story. I can't give you sort of the exact numbers on how many bishops may have been present, and of course, sort of many bishops were cautious about civil rights. You know, they did sort of take heroic stands on integrating Catholic schools in advance of Brown v. Board. Bishops in the South threatened excommunication on parishes that refused to allow Black Catholics to worship. You know, so there were efforts that bishops did sort of lean in on their authority to make it clear where the church stood on integration. But at the same time, I'm thinking of this one episode when, I can't remember if it was 1988, 1989, but Sister Thea Bowman gave an address to the U.S. bishops, and it happened to be at Seton Hall University, which is one of the reasons I remember this particular episode. But she was talking about them, and she sort of mentioned to sort of, you know, how the fact that the clergy were always in the front. And why are in the front? Because they're the ones who are going to get hit by the fire hoses and the dogs, and sort of making sort of the Catholic bishops sort of realize like, oh, like, you know, it's important to sort of have that religious presence on the front lines. And then she had them all join hands and sort of sing "We Shall Overcome," you know, kind of in a way sort of reminding them of that important work of civil rights and racial justice that still needs to be done. But yes, kind of I recognize that sort of it's a very complicated story that we only got part of to sort of look at the Catholic response to sort of race and integration and civil rights. Involves a lot of local case studies, and historians have been doing a lot of work on that topic. Calling attention to both the great gains and kind of the heroic example of Catholics, but also kind of the shortcomings. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
I think you have someone up in the corner there, Patty Brandy. You have a question?
Not a question, a comment. This all sounds very calm, very sweet, and you like the period. Growing up in the period was very, very difficult. It was not sweet. People were constantly cutting you down, telling you were bold and brazen, things like that. Nuns. And I know they had big classes. I was a teacher, I understand. But they were not Christian at all, many of them.
I mean, I guess part of, I want to be mindful of trying to balance the sort of the good and the bad in looking back at this period. Because for many, as I said in the beginning, it was a Catholic golden age, but you do read those memoirs and there's a lot of anguish, and there's a way that kind of the childhood innocence can overshadow some of the more difficult aspects of it. You know, sort of things like classroom discipline is one, but you can also think about things like kind of the emphasis on sort of sexuality and policing sexuality, and the ways that kind of the Catholic social ethic could be sort of a very difficult burden for many.
Critical thinking is also important. And they really didn't rise above a certain level. And they weren't proud of you for rising above a certain level. They just wanted to beat you down. I did not appreciate it, as you can tell.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, there's sort of that side of Catholic education, kind of in those images of sort of sister with the ruler, but then also recognizing kind of how Catholic education did open up opportunities for many. It may have been a rigorous education, but to some extent it was a good education for many. So this is where sort of historians, we do have to be careful, and your comments remind me that we have to be careful about generalizations. And so we need to
romanticizing when you weren't there.
Right. To sort of weigh those different experiences. I see.
Another Spirit Alive attendee without
Yes.
name.
There's no name, but sort of somebody who's a spiritual life attendee.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Oh,
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay. Hi. Thank you. This was very insightful, and I enjoy it very much. I have a comment and two questions. One is there is actually a St. Elizabeth shrine in Manhattan. Mother Seton's house was turned into a shrine on 7th State Street or State Avenue in Manhattan. That is a shrine, not as big as the Basilica in Emmitsburg, but nonetheless, there is a St. Elizabeth shrine in Manhattan in the Archdiocese of New York. I just wanted to clarify that. But my question for you is, I was amazed to see that Catholic schools, unfortunately, were already going down since the 1970s. Like, oh my goodness, because now I work for the Archdiocese of New York, and it's like every other week we're closing a school. So I thought this was just a new phenomenon, but it sounds like this nightmare has started way back when. So it's sad, but it's still, this presentation kind of helped me. But I want to go back to what two things: the abuse. Do you think, because again, another thing about working for the Archdiocese is we're dealing with the consequences of the abuse. Most of the cases were in the 1940s, 1950s, and so forth and so on. So then, do you think that these abuses, some of the case for that was this idea, this I guess carte blanche that clergy and religious were given back in that time period? That's one question. And the second question is on immigration. You mentioned briefly about there was a time, and I should know this, but I don't know, when immigration was closed in the U.S. What was the church response? Because we're in a similar terrain right now in the United States, and Pope Francis just sent out a letter, and I'm amazed at how many of our priests are tearing him to pieces for writing that letter, disappointingly so. But nonetheless, they're going back to that history to say to him, we never did that until Vatican II. This stupid, mindless thing about open immigration did exist in the church teaching. So are they now listening to you now? I'm like, oh, they are referring to something that was really the case. So anyways, if you can answer those two questions, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, there was a lot there. Thank you for the clarification about the Seton Shrine. I'm not exactly sure the year that it opened, but it is down there on State Street. The issue with schools, kind of going in order, the issue with schools, it's not the schools were necessarily closing in the 1970s. It's just that in some ways they had expanded the system to accommodate the baby boom. And then kind of as that starts to contract, you were left with these hulking buildings that were never going to fill again, just because of demographic numbers. So they became harder to maintain. And so sort of pastors are looking at sort of schools that like they looked empty because they only have 300 students instead of 1,000 students. So that became part of the struggle during that period. And by the 1970s, you're starting to pay lay salaries and things like that. So not as much that they're closing, but just sort of that in some ways Catholics had overbuilt in order to respond to a demographic bubble that inevitably burst.
Okay.
Sort of on the sort of abuse cases, sort of that's a difficult one. The John Jay reports that the Catholic Church commissioned sort of showed that the high point, like the most incidents, took place in the sort of the 60s and 70s, but there's certainly cases that go back to the 40s, 50s, 60s. And this is sort of the great question of like, why was that allowed to happen? You know, and part of it had to do with kind of Catholic culture at the time. And I'm offering just sort of the, you know, kind of a very brief answer to a complex question. But when you had kind of these sort of rhythms of parish life where the priest was a trusted figure, was welcomed into the home, there was a way that they were able to sort of read the situation in a way. And it also didn't help that kind of understandings sort of kind of spiritual formation or sort of psychological formation were not very well sort of were not considered very well as part of religious formation of that time, when you have sort of young men who are sort of entering the seminary kind of right out of high school or even kind of going into junior seminaries. You know, you were sort of in this all-encompassing world where you simply didn't talk about those issues. And so again, kind of those comments that we had a little bit earlier about sort of the downside of this romance of the period is that there was kind of a lot of unspoken stuff. And so it includes just sort of issues of sexuality, of authority, of clericalism. And then, of course, the fact that nobody within the hierarchy sort of acted on those issues. Or if they did, they treated it the way that they thought was best, sort of keeping it secret, protecting the reputation of the priest, but also protecting the reputation of the family, sending priests for counseling, you know, and then trusting medical authorities who said, yes, the priest is safe to return to ministry. So it's sort of those sorts of things where they were operating under certain assumptions that we now know were sort of faulty and harmful. And then your last question about immigration. It was 1924 when immigration restriction was put in place. So I'm blanking on the specific question that you had, but, you know, certainly, you know, sort of how Catholics responded. You know, Catholics sort of spoke out against those restrictions, you know, in part because Catholics were the ones who were sort of affected by those immigration restrictions, and not just sort of bishops, but also Catholic groups like Italian Catholics were very active after World War II in trying to get those immigration restrictions lifted. So kind of, you know, kind of that was perhaps one place where the Catholic Church was speaking out, but kind of also in the context of sort of Cold War concerns and things like that, those kind of, if you look sort of for Catholic public voices in the 1940s and 50s, anti-communism seems to dominate. Immigration reform is perhaps more muted, but there were places where they were helping refugees, thinking about groups like, I think in one of my previous lectures, I talked about Operation Peter Pan, which was to help sort of the Cuban diaspora sort of escaping sort of the Castro regime. And so children were sort of transported to Florida, to Miami, and assisted by Catholic charities. So there are those sorts of efforts that are taking place.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comments.
It is 8:20, and this was a lively conversation. I'm grateful for all of you for coming. Join us next week for Tom's final night with us. I thank all of you for coming, and maybe tonight, in addition to all the other prayers that we say for peace in our world, a special remembrance of Pope Francis, who's very ill, as we learned today, with double pneumonia. So we pray that the angel Raphael, who's always the angel that is connected with healing and physical health, be with him tonight, help him, return him to full health so he can lead the church with the same courage and ability that he has led now since 2013. So good night, everybody, and see you next week. Okay? Good night, Jean. It was nice to see you.